Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 120 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Well, AI is very much a hot topic across most industries within the country, certainly around employment down the track. But and the property market is certainly no different to that. Property buyers can now ask AI any sorts of questions and gather huge amounts of information as well. At a minimum, it's things like demographics, median house prices, sale history, and that's just to name a few. There's plenty of other areas where you can gather information, but by no means is it perfect either. And some of these programs, particularly around assessing values for property buyers, AI is very much there to satisfy the user and sometimes to provide the information that they want to hear rather than what perhaps they need to hear. And that can be a real query when it comes to valuation sides of things. And it's a danger that investors start to take all information from AI as fact, which can start to repress human traits such as just being skeptical and asking questions and making sure that you're getting the right information. Because it is well known that AI does tend to hallucinate when it lacks raw information. And some of the answers that it gives, it provides with absolute certainty, even though it's not necessarily correct. Now, when there's glaring mistakes, it becomes quite obvious and the user can generally see that. But it's when it's not a glaring mistake that there can start to become a few issues and things can slip through, which then can impact on decisions based on the information that's been provided. So that's something that you need to be querying. The problem is that if you're having to check up on everything, the query then becomes, well, why am I using AI in the first place? Now it's getting better and better, and I certainly am not keeping up with it across a lot of areas, but from a property perspective, we keep a very close eye on it. And so we're wanting to make sure that it is going to be useful and that it is going to be beneficial to us and obviously to our clients as well. So I thought today I wanted to focus more on the valuation side of things and the value assessment side and how AI tools are being used and how they gather information and how that compares to us as individuals doing our own assessments, doing our own physical inspections and gathering our own information. So to start off with, I'll look at it from a perspective of what AI relies upon when it's doing these valuation assessments. And the first one is very much around sales results, which obviously we as humans would do the same thing as well. The difficulty is that it's only as good as with all of us as the information that's being provided to us or to it, and it doesn't necessarily have the ability yet to determine what's a mistake and what's not. Whereas a human can look at something and assess it. So for instance, if the incorrect number, so it should be a $1,100,000 purchase and it's been put in as a $2 million or a $3 million, well, you can look at that and say, I know that house is not worth that. There's a mistake there. I'm going to put that to one side. Or it could be that there's been a number left out. So instead of being $1 million purchase, it's a $100,000 purchase. Okay, that's not right. We can, but AI doesn't necessarily have the ability to do that, particularly with a lot of the free valuation tools that are readily available. And so that can give the incorrect information, which then leads to an incorrect valuation assessment. So that's something that really needs to be considered. The other one is being able to look at information and determine whether or not a transaction is actually a market transaction. And what I mean by that is many of the sales that we look at across our databases, particularly when you take into account the value of general sales, include everything. And so that's things like, say, a family sale where parents may sell a property to a child that they've owned for a period of time, and there's a family discount because of certain circumstances, but that isn't necessarily considered. Or it could be perhaps a divorce and there's a buyout of one party to another, but the value on the property is at a lower level because other parts of the settlement have been taken into account, whether that's around superannuation or other cash reserves that may have been allocated to the other partner, and therefore the discount on the property is applied. So it's not necessarily reflective of what market value is. Or it could be something like an adjoining owner purchase where someone's prepared to pay a premium for a property because it's going to add significant value to theirs. So to the general market, that's not where value sits. But to this particular buyer, it's worth a hell of a lot more. So that doesn't necessarily reflect what market value is either. And AI doesn't necessarily have the ability to determine that as to whether or not it is reflective of market value levels. So it's something that just needs to be remembered. The next one is around property details, and this is a bit like value assessments and assessing comparables, because when it comes to property details, again, it's the information that AI can analyse is only as good as what's been put in front of it. But it can take into account incorrect information. So things like it might have been that someone's made a mistake and marked a property as a 4-bedroom house when it's actually only a 2-bedroom house. And so AI assumes that it can compare that. Or it could be that it's been marked down as a house when in actual fact it's an apartment. And so it's compared at a lower level when it should be at a higher level. So these are things that need to be taken into account, and that heavy reliance on the correct information. So it needs to be correct. Now, a human, as I said before, can double check that and can look at those sorts of things. But if you're having to double check everything, then it becomes, well, I may as well be doing this on my own. The next one is that AI tends to treat all sales as equal, and not all sales are the same. And what I mean by that is it's not probably as sophisticated yet, but this is an area where we will see significant improvement, and we already have, but it will continue to improve fairly drastically. And this is going to be an area where it will be able to make decisions and really start to analyse sales evidence a bit more. So what I'm talking about here is things like the position of a property within a street. So for example, as a development site, is the property being on the corner giving 2 street frontages, meaning that all townhouses that may be constructed on that site can have their own street frontage, so no need for common property, which means a developer will pay a premium for that. So being able to analyse that out and look at that. The orientation, obviously north facing being on one side of the street or south facing on the other, there'll be a premium paid for that. Again, particularly when there's potential construction and large frontages and people wanting to maximise natural light. The condition of the property is something that needs to be considered significantly as well. And that's not just around pure renovations, that's just around the overall condition. And so it's very important, these aspects, when assessing value and being able to analyse them and determine where you put premiums on certain elements and where you take reductions off for others. And then the next one and the final one in this is AI needs on-market transactions to be able to analyse. So if a property, as an example, has never sold or hasn't sold for sort of 25, 30 plus years, its last transaction may have occurred prior to the internet playing a big role in real estate sales. So whereby properties used to be advertised obviously in print. So there's not a lot of information about that property online, and therefore analysing it and gathering information is quite difficult because there's not much there. So that combined with, say, off-market sales, where there hasn't been a reasonable amount of information provided, makes it difficult for AI to make those assessments, where in comparison, if you walk through that property, you can look at it and see then how it compares to others. So being able to physically inspect and analyse things out that way is of great advantage in that regard too. Now, we'll move on. The second part is that I wanted to look at from this AI assessment side of things is how what human inspections gather, the information that they can gather that perhaps AI will miss. So the first one here is particularly looking at surrounding development, and I think that's a really important component to this. Being able to look at, for instance, the proximity of alternate uses surrounding the subject property, and how that might influence value. So things like being, how close are you to perhaps an industrial development or some form of commercial use that may impact on residential. So if you're very close to retail and there's restaurants, cafes, fish and chip shops, takeaway shops, that sort of thing, the smell that might come out of that could have an impact on value, or noise from industrial sides of things. Being near a train line and the proximity to that train line is something that you can pick up and determine whether or not that's going to. And it doesn't necessarily have to be directly opposite. It could just be a street or so away, but the noise from that train may be something that could impact, or the fly rails now that go around as well. So these are sorts of things. And another big one that we see in certain parts of Melbourne is the high voltage power lines. And they can certainly have a significant impact on people's perspective and really limit the demand levels, because some buyers just will not even consider them. The other one is not just necessarily surrounding development, but specifically adjoining uses. So perhaps an apartment block directly next to a house, which might have overlooking or overshadowing issues, or a derelict home nearby that might have people living in there that perhaps not as desirable, and you don't necessarily want that type of property as a neighbour, or vacant land as well. So the uncertainty around what might actually be constructed on that site, and whether or not that could cause issues and devalue the property. So these are all assessed or things that can be considered, and that a person looking would take into account that perhaps the AI valuation assessments may not look at. The next one is the quality of a renovation. Now, I know nearly every person that either listens or views this podcast will have looked at a property online and then gone and inspected it at some point and thought, that's not what I expected when I looked at this online. The photos don't give an accurate perspective of what this property actually looks like. And sometimes that can be as simple as a coat of paint and new carpet, but perhaps it's been done to cover things up. And sometimes it is just as simple as, there's been a few cracks, or we've painted some tiles in the bathroom and made some slight improvements to a kitchen. But things can look very different when you arrive. But sometimes it's not even that extreme in terms of the renovation versus unrenovated. Sometimes it is renovated, but how well has it been renovated? So is it a Bunnings kitchen that's been put in, or have they had some form of cabinet maker come out and make everything specific and particularly to that property that gives it that point of difference and makes it a really bespoke type offering, versus something that's a bit more generic. And so you don't necessarily get that with just viewing online and what AI would look at. When you get there, you get the feeling that, no, I can see how good a quality this is, or I can see perhaps how not the quality that this is. It can be sometimes it's not necessarily to that level either. It's the quality of the floor covering. So the quality of timber floors can vary greatly. The quality of carpet can vary greatly. The quality of appliances that have been installed can vary greatly. So all of those sorts of things that perhaps may not be necessarily as apparent from looking at things online will become very apparent once you go and physically inspect something. Probably one of the most important that I'm not convinced yet that AI takes into account, and again, it's something that perhaps it hopefully will be able to down the track, is the floor plan. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's probably whenever I see something new come online, I really don't skip through photos. The first thing I go to is to look at how the floor plan works and where it sits and how it flows and whether or not it's got the right layout for that type of property. And I think floor plan is such an important component to making a decision around whether or not a property works to pursue it, and certainly around how you're going to value assess that property. If a property doesn't have the right proportions, if it doesn't connect the dwelling in the right way, it can seriously reduce its value. So bedrooms and bathrooms and living zones, they're all really important, but if they're not in the right spots within the development, within the house or the apartment, then it can really detract from someone's livability and whether or not they're going to be prepared to pay a premium for that type of property. So the nuance that AI, I'm just not convinced it captures that floor plan element just yet. And something similar to that from an apartment and a unit perspective, and even a townhouse point of view, is the position of that dwelling within a development. And I think that's a really important part as well, because the position in the block can have a significant influence on value, whether that's the privacy, so whether or not there's neighbouring properties that can look in on you, particularly in a larger apartment block, you might have other buildings that are close by that can see in. Then it can really influence the natural light. So in some of the older style apartment buildings, if you're down lower and there's neighbouring properties nearby or trees, that sort of thing, they can be quite dark. There can be noise issues if you're sitting right on a driveway or right near where the bins are stored. So that can be a bit of an issue. And obviously aspect as well. The more elevated you are, the more chances you are of having a really nice view out over a street or perhaps of the city or of water views, that sort of thing too. So position in the block from an apartment and from a unit point of view, villa units being at the front is typically seen as being the most desirable because you've got a street aspect, but some people like the rear element because you can quite often get a bigger backyard, but also the privacy of not having people going past you all the time. So there's different preferences there, but position in block is not necessarily something that is overly well considered, but I think again that will improve over time. The structural integrity of a property is really important. So the integrity of the improvements obviously factors significantly into value assessments, and a lot of similar to what we said before, a lot of photos and things won't necessarily show the negative elements and the structural integrity. So you can walk into a property and notice that there's cracks in certain areas that certainly haven't been shown in photos, or you can walk in, particularly with period brick homes, and have a really strong smell of dampness or mustiness, which can sometimes be a clear sign of rising damp, that sort of thing. So that physical inspection and that building integrity can, and another one, that I've just thought of is around water coming off the downpipes and things. And again, particularly with older style properties, sometimes they're not connected to stormwater drains, and they are just dumped into the neighbouring property or into the property itself, and water just flows under. So the integrity then can be hampered. But most people can walk into a house and feel whether or not it needs to be re-stumped and whether there's issues there. That's going to be pretty difficult for AI to be able to do, and evidence is not shown by that online. And then the final one is around personal preferences, and it's a pretty simple one, but there'll be certain elements to buying a property that you will value that perhaps even the general market won't. And if you find certain things really important, you're going to need to see those, and you may pay a premium for those, but others may not, or you may detract certain ththings that others might find valuable, but that might impact on yours. So things like, as I said before, that adjoining owner purchase. If you've got a specific reason to buy a property, then you might pay a premium for that, and the AI assessment won't necessarily factor that in. I've certainly seen a lot of times where premiums have been paid for properties, and I've then spoken to an agent afterwards to find out what was behind that. And there was one in Blackburn about 2 years ago, and I found out afterwards that the purchaser lived around the corner, and they wanted lived in that street, and they wanted something for their elderly parents to be close by, and were pretty much going to do whatever they needed to buy that property. And it was certainly well above what I saw as market value, but from a personal preference perspective, that suited them really well. So that's hard to ascertain when it comes to assessing values. So I guess what I wanted, the takeaway from here though, should be that I'm not trying to say that AI doesn't have a place, because I absolutely think it does. I think it's going to get better and better around assessing value. But a lot of the things that it utilises relies on information that needs to be double checked and made sure that it is reliable and it is accurate. And I think as it gets better at being able to determine itself whether or not that's right or that's right, and whether or not it's reflective of what you need it to be, the better it gets at that, the more reliable it will be for you to utilise and rely upon. I guess some of the ones that a lot of people use from a valuation assessment perspective at the moment are the free ones on generic websites, which provide information which can be useful, but I guess what I would say is you get what you pay for, and those sorts of things which are free and generic don't necessarily paint the full picture of where value assessments and how they should be made. And that might be my valuer background coming out of me a bit. But the case study for today was a website assessment that we had where a client came to us a few years ago after we'd purchased a property for them. And they were very concerned that it had gone backwards in value, and we were assuring them from our knowledge that it certainly hadn't, and that it had more likely increased in value in a pretty short space of time. But they were adamant that it had gone backwards. And once we asked them why, they said, "Oh, well, it's telling me the website's telling me that it's only worth X dollars, and I paid Y for it." And it was about $100,000 difference in a sort of 12 to 18 month period. So we went away and did some due diligence and looked at things, and the website had assessed the value of the property at $100,000 less, exactly in line with another apartment that had sold within this block within the previous 3 months, even though we'd paid a bit more than that for this property previously. The difficult thing was for this person that they didn't know, once we did our analysis, that property that the AI instrument had relied upon was actually a family sale. And we could see the vendor and the purchaser, and it was clearly a relative that had bought one and another out. And therefore, the value of the property wasn't market rate, it wasn't market reflective. Once we explained that to them and explained why it had been done, they felt a lot more relieved and very understanding. But again, it's just another reason to be cautious around some of these valuation assessments, that's all. But thanks very much for joining me. That's episode 120 in the book. As always, please feel free to share the podcast far and wide. Subscribe on our YouTube and podcast channels, and share the podcast far and wide with friends and family. Otherwise, if you'd like further information, visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.